I folded my nightgown first, the blue one with the little embroidered daisies. Then my travel slippers, soft-soled, faded at the heel, wrapped gently in a grocery bag, the same way I used to pack Brian's baby shoes when he was small and we went anywhere overnight. I wasn't planning to stay long, just the weekend, maybe an extra day if the kids wanted me to help with the little ones. Kayla had said it would be a family trip. Her exact words were, "The kids love having you around. You should come." So I did what any mother would do. I believed her. The night before we left, I baked oatmeal raisin cookies, Brian's favorite since second grade. I used the old metal tin he painted for me in art class, chipped on the lid, but it still sealed tight. I packed my puzzle book, my blood pressure pills, and the crossword dictionary no one else in the house ever touched. There was a time when I used to hide surprise notes in Brian's lunchbox. This time, I slipped a $20 bill into each of the grandchildren's socks. Just a little treat for the mountain snack shop they might visit. It felt nice, preparing. It felt like I still had a place. The car ride started quietly. Kayla drove, eyes fixed on the road. Brian was in the passenger seat, thumbing through emails. The children were in the back, lost in screens, not once looking up to say hello when I climbed in. I didn't take it personally. I reminded myself how teenagers are, detached, distracted. Still, I tried to ask them what they were looking forward to. Hikes, maybe a campfire. But I don't think they heard me, or if they did, nothing registered. We stopped once for gas, and I offered to buy snacks. Kayla smiled tightly and said, "We're good." Brian mumbled something about needing to get there before check-in. The rest of the ride was just trees and silence. I pressed my forehead to the window, watching pine needles blur past, and counted how many times Brian glanced at me in the mirror. 3. Only 3. By the time we arrived at the cabin, the sun had already dipped low. It was beautiful, secluded, quiet, the kind of place where you could hear your own breath. The kids rushed out laughing, and Kayla followed them into the house. I lingered at the trunk, lifting my modest duffel and the cookie tin. Brian came back to grab the coolers. I asked him where I should sleep. He didn't answer right away, just stood there holding the cooler straps. Then he said, "We'll figure it out." That night, we had grilled chicken and roasted vegetables. I ate slowly. No one asked me about my day, about the neighbor's dog I used to walk, or the lavender I planted near the fence. I told myself they were tired. Everyone's always tired these days. I washed the dishes without being asked and went to bed early. The mattress was stiff, the sheets crisp but cold. I laid there with my hands folded over my stomach, listening to the faint hum of laughter from the other room. In the morning, they packed early. Kayla said they wanted to explore a higher trail somewhere farther out. "Probably too much for your knees, right?" she added, almost kindly. Brian didn't look at me when he zipped up his hiking pack. The kids barely looked up. "We'll be back by dinner," Kayla said. "There's tea and books in the common room." Then they left. And I sat there, in the little wooden chair by the fireplace, clutching my slippers like they were something sacred, something worth carrying up a mountain no one wanted me to climb. I waited until I could no longer hear the engine. The gravel had stopped crunching, and even the echo of laughter had dissolved into the pine stillness. I sat with my hands in my lap for another 10 minutes, maybe 15, just in case they'd forgotten something, a phone charger, a scarf, one of the kids remembering they needed sunscreen. But nothing stirred. The cabin was quiet. It wasn't the first time I'd been left alone. In my old house, before Brian got married, there were whole weekends where I spoke to no one. Back then, I welcomed the silence. It meant rest, reading, time to be still. But this silence was different. This one buzzed, like something left humming under the skin. I made myself tea. Earl Grey, lukewarm water from the cabin's kettle. I poured it carefully into one of the mismatched mugs from the cupboard and carried it outside, where I could watch the tree line and wait for the sound of tires on the distant road. Time passed strangely. The sun rose high and then dipped without urgency. I read one chapter of a paperback someone had left behind. Then another. Ate one of my cookies, though they didn't taste as sweet anymore. Around mid-afternoon, I put on my sweater, more out of instinct than chill. The shadows were longer by then. I walked to the front of the cabin and looked out at the trailhead sign, half expecting to see Brian's blue SUV turning back up the slope. Nothing. I checked my phone. No signal. I tried standing in different corners of the yard, raised the phone above my head like I'd seen the kids do. Still nothing. Inside, I sat down slowly, trying not to imagine the what-ifs. Maybe they got a flat. Maybe the trail was harder than expected. Maybe the car broke down and they didn't want to worry me. But the silence kept growing and the tea had gone cold. By early evening, I began to understand. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't an emergency. This was intentional. I opened the fridge and counted 3 bottles of water and half a loaf of sandwich bread. Nothing prepared. No real groceries stocked. Just enough for a night, not enough for a weekend. The cooler Kayla had packed had gone with them. Even the children's hiking boots, small ones I'd once helped them lace, were missing from the front step. No plan for my return, no intention to bring me along. I sat again, this time at the little wooden table. My hands folded neatly, my slippers tucked beneath me. There were no tears, not yet. I told myself I needed to think clearly, to be calm. So I listed what I had. My wallet, some cash, my ID, one fully charged phone that didn't work here, and a single small suitcase of clothes I might never wear again. At 6:45 p.m., I packed the cookies back into the tin. At 7:10, I zipped up my duffel. At 7:35, I stepped outside and locked the cabin door behind me. The key they had left on the table, like a formality. I didn't take it. A mile down the road, past the first curve, I flagged down a maintenance truck. The man behind the wheel asked if I was all right. I told him yes, I just needed to get to the nearest town with a signal. He offered a ride without questions. I accepted. I held my tin of cookies on my lap the whole way, both hands gripping it like it might explain something I still couldn't. We didn't speak much, but just before I stepped out, he asked, "Did they leave you?" I looked at him. I thought about all the ways I could answer. All the years, all the holidays, all the slow drifts away. I said, "They forgot who I was." Then I thanked him and closed the door, walking into the town I didn't know, under a sky that had already begun to darken. The bus back to the city left just after 6 a.m., its engine groaning like it hadn't rested in years. I sat near the middle, wrapped in the same cardigan I wore up the mountain, a little stiffer now from the night I spent curled up in a roadside inn with lights that never quite turned off. I didn't sleep, not really. Just stared at the ceiling fan above me, listening to it wobble with every rotation, thinking about how silence can hum when it's full of memory. I held my duffel bag in my lap the entire way, not because I feared losing it, but because it was all I had left of the version of myself they knew. Slippers, one dress shirt, a tin of uneaten cookies, and a phone still out of signal. When we crossed into city limits, the sun was already high, casting long shadows across the sidewalk cafes and car dealerships. I looked out the window, watching the world move past me, as if nothing had happened. As if mothers weren't being left in cabins on purpose. At the station, I stood for a moment, uncertain. The usual impulse would be to call someone, to call Brian, to ask what happened, to give him a chance to explain. But I didn't. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted to punish him, but because there was a deeper quiet settling in, the kind that only comes after years of shrinking yourself to fit other people's comfort. Instead of heading home, my legal home, the one I still paid taxes on, where my name was carved beside Brian's on the mailbox, I walked 3 blocks west and stepped into a nondescript building with brown trim and old blinds. It was a rental office I remembered from when I used to help my friend Nadine find housing for new teachers. The woman at the desk had kind eyes and didn't ask too many questions. I filled out a form, paid for 6 months in advance, and received a set of keys that jingled like something new. The apartment wasn't much. A 3rd-floor unit overlooking a parking lot, beige walls, stove that ticked before it clicked on. But it had a bolt I could turn from the inside. It had no memories, no voices rising behind closed doors, no arguments muffled through vents. It had a chair by the window, just wide enough to sit and drink tea and not be noticed. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't forward my mail. I left the house, the one they lived in, the one I had signed over rights to a year earlier after Kayla said it would simplify paperwork, untouched. Let them wonder where I'd gone. Let them tell stories to their friends about poor old Mom, how she must have wandered off, how maybe the trip had shaken her. Maybe it had. Maybe in the best possible way. I changed my number, not dramatically, just enough. The woman at the phone kiosk asked if I wanted to transfer my contacts. I said no. I wanted space between me and every number that expected me to answer out of habit. For groceries, I walked. For cash, I used the smallest bills. At night, I opened the cookie tin, not to eat them, but just to remember what it felt like to try. The smell was still faintly there. Sugar, cinnamon, something warm that didn't belong anymore. I slid the tin under the bed and didn't touch it again. No one knocked. No one called the rental office asking for Elaine Mercer, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like something waiting to be claimed. I just felt still. The office hadn't changed since the last time I sat in it. Same rust-colored chairs, same framed diploma with a crooked corner, same clock that clicked too loudly between thoughts. Mr. Landon greeted me like I'd only been gone a week, though it had been nearly 3 years since I last reviewed anything with him. Back then, it was about adjusting my will, making room for Kayla and the grandchildren, consolidating assets for simpler planning, as Brian called it. I had agreed to all of it, signed where they pointed, smiled when they thanked me. This time, I didn't bring cookies. I handed Mr. Landon a small folder. Inside was a list, handwritten, of every shared account I still had access to. Every title with my name on it, every insurance beneficiary, every emergency contact that still routed through Brian's number. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't tilt his head in concern or narrow his eyes with suspicion. He simply reached for a pen. "We'll remove your name from the house first," he said, flipping through old deeds he still had copies of. "Though technically, since you'd already signed over the equity share, they won't feel it until something needs refinancing." "That's fine," I said. "Next, the education account for Lily and Max?" "Yes," I replied. "Close it. Transfer the remainder to my name only, and then withdraw." "All of it?" I nodded. He paused only once, glancing up when I handed him a final document. A letter to be kept sealed, to be opened only in the event of my death, addressed to Brian. I told him it wasn't for delivery, just for holding. He tucked it away in a manila envelope without another word. We spent 2 hours going over paperwork. Not once did he ask why. Not once did he pry. That was the thing about professionals who'd seen too many families smile in public and crumble behind closed doors. They knew better than to assume peace from photos. Mr. Landon had drawn up divorces where couples still held hands. He had rewritten trusts days after weddings. He knew silence could be louder than accusation. Before I left, he offered me a cup of tea. I declined. Outside, the sky had shifted to that strange pale gray just before evening settles in. I walked slowly back to the apartment, listening to the way my footsteps landed without echo. I passed a playground, empty. A bakery with its lights off. A teenager leaned against a wall, scrolling through his phone, hoodie pulled tight against the chill. I kept walking. That night, I folded the extra copies of the legal documents and placed them in the cookie tin, which had now become something else. Not a reminder of what I'd baked, but what I'd stopped offering. I slid the tin back under the bed, alongside a new phone, unregistered, and a prepaid envelope I hadn't yet decided how to use. I didn't cry. There was no grief left for what they'd chosen. Only the clarity that comes when something has settled so thoroughly, it no longer requires explanation. They would feel it eventually, not as a punishment, but as absence. It must have started with a phone call, not to me, of course not, but to Brian, perhaps from the admissions office, or maybe the bursar. A polite reminder, the kind that arrives in early September before classes truly begin. We're just following up on the outstanding balance for Lily's enrollment this semester. There's always a grace period, always a tone of assumed understanding. Parents forget. Cards change. But this wasn't a delay. It was a stop. The transfer didn't go through. That would have surprised them. The education account had always paid on time, quietly, and without prompting. I set it up when Lily was born. Brian had said they couldn't afford to think long-term yet, so I did it for them. Each birthday, each holiday, I tucked in a little more. Not flashy, not loud, just steady. Like most things I offered. But now the balance was zero. No error, no glitch, just absence. I imagined Kayla scrolling through her banking app in a quiet panic, refreshing the screen like it would change something. I imagined the way her voice must have sharpened at Brian, the questions falling out of her too fast for him to answer. And Brian, fumbling, confused, reaching for explanations that didn't exist anymore. Because I hadn't told them. I hadn't said a word. One day, the support was there. The next, it simply wasn't. They wouldn't have known about the meeting with Mr. Landon, or the forms I signed, or the quiet rerouting of funds into a personal account, then out again. Used, yes, but on myself. Rent, groceries, a new coat for winter. All things I once denied myself, so their home could have more. I didn't check in on them, but news has a way of finding you when you don't ask. Nadine called one afternoon, just to say hello. We hadn't spoken in months, not since she moved out to Arizona. She brought up Lily. Saw on Facebook that her school plans hit a snag, something about re-enrollment issues. I only said, "Oh?" and kept stirring my tea. That week, the first letter arrived. Not handwritten, not emotional. Just a printed form Brian must have downloaded from some family finance site. A statement of confusion, a request to verify account access, a few blank signature lines. I placed it on the table beside my teacup and let it sit for 3 days before I shredded it. No return envelope, no follow-up. I didn't owe him an answer. By mid-month, the second letter came, softer this time. Fewer printed words, more handwritten ones. "Just checking in," he wrote, as if I hadn't been dropped at the side of a mountain 2 months earlier, with a sweater and a tin of cookies. "Kayla's worried. The kids miss you. We're trying to understand." I didn't respond. Because I had nothing left to translate. Silence had become my only fluent language. One morning, while sweeping the small balcony of my apartment, I noticed a man across the street, standing too still, pretending to look at his phone. He wasn't dressed like a neighbor. I watched him for 5 full minutes before he moved. I didn't panic. I didn't call anyone. I simply returned inside, turned off the lights, and sat near the window, just out of view. It was beginning. The unraveling. The slow, quiet dismantling of the story they had built, where I was the willing caretaker, the tireless helper, the bank that never closed. And now, in the absence of my permission, the house they lived in no longer had a foundation. I didn't feel triumph, only stillness, as if something long buried beneath duty had finally shifted and breathed. The first time I saw the post, it had already been shared 16 times. A photo of Brian standing in front of the porch, my old porch, his hand resting on Lily's shoulder, the caption written with just enough tremble to sound believable. Please reach out if anyone has heard from our mother. She's been distant and confused since the trip. We're very concerned for her safety. Concerned. The word curled strangely in my chest. Not angry, not sorry, concerned. There was no mention of the cabin, no confession about the car that never returned. Just a crafted fog of worry, like smoke pumped into a room to make everyone feel sympathetic before they realize the exits are gone. In the comments, people chimed in, friends from their circle. So sorry, Brian. Hope she's okay. Sending prayers. Someone even wrote, didn't she used to help at the library? Sweet woman. I didn't reply. I didn't correct them. Let them think what they wanted. Because that was the freedom I'd never had before, the right to remain misinterpreted. It happened again at church. Nadine called the following Sunday, her voice low. They asked for prayers for you during announcements. Said you were struggling mentally, that you'd been distant. The whole room bowed their heads. I thanked her, not because I appreciated the sentiment, but because she'd told me without asking for anything in return. Nadine knew. She'd seen me mop the fellowship hall while Brian took calls outside. She'd watched me bring cupcakes to every bake sale, only to stand alone beside the table. She'd once whispered to me after service, "You do more for them than they notice." So when she said, "I know you're not lost," I believed her. In the days that followed, the story kept circling, small whispers that drifted past my new life like fog across a quiet street. A former neighbor called and left a voicemail. "Elaine, if you need anything, just let me know. We're all praying you come back home." But home was no longer a place that could be pointed to on a map. It was a silence I'd built brick by brick. And the story, her mind's not right, she's been distant, something must have happened, became the version that gave them cover. It made them the ones left behind, the victims of a mother's mysterious withdrawal. It protected their image while softening mine. And I let it happen. Because some battles aren't worth waging aloud. Some truths are too heavy to hand to people who've only ever carried what benefits them. In the quiet of my apartment, I sorted through new bank statements. Everything clean, everything separate. I made tea, rearranged my bookshelf, hung a single photo of myself on the wall, taken 5 years ago at a retreat with women who laughed with me, not at me. For the first time, I saw myself as separate, not a role, not a fixture, just a person. There were moments, of course, when I wondered if they believed their own version. If Brian had said the lie enough times that he'd started to feel like it was true. If Kayla rehearsed her sighs of exhaustion at social events, explaining how hard it was to lose support from someone so unstable. But I didn't chase their narrative. I simply watched it drift away, like a helium balloon slipping from a child's grip. It was theirs to mourn, not mine to catch. I didn't know the building manager's name, but I remembered the logo on the notice. Blue letters on white paper, crisp and impersonal. Someone must have taken a photo of it taped to the front door, a 72-hour warning for non-payment. The kind of slip that flaps in the wind like laundry someone forgot to take down. I didn't go looking for it. It found me. Nadine sent it, quietly. No message, just the image. I stared at it for a long time, not because I needed to process what it meant, but because it looked familiar. Not the paper, not the building, but the silence behind it. I knew that kind of quiet. The kind that comes when no one answers the phone, when bills stack on counters and no one has the courage to open the envelopes. Brian had always thought the world bent for people who spoke firmly, who filed complaints and played reasonable. But leases don't wait for tone. Mortgage companies don't forgive on charm. And when the tuition fell through, and the education account dried up, and my name was no longer on the fallback reserves, the world stopped bending. They'd been living in my old house, not renting, not paying a mortgage, just occupying. It had been a temporary arrangement, they said, after Kayla's contract fell through. Just until we get back on our feet. I hadn't pushed back. At the time, I still believed in the value of being useful. Now, the house was gone. Mr. Landon filed the papers quietly, and without my name to anchor the deed, the remaining title floated, unsecured, leveraged in ways I hadn't been told. Brian must have used it as collateral, maybe for a car, maybe to consolidate debt. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. The letter from the bank that arrived at my new apartment 6 weeks earlier, forwarded in error, had said enough. Primary equity holder no longer meets requirements for collateral security. The translation was simple. I was no longer the net, and without me, the whole thing cracked. They moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. 1 parking spot, no washer-dryer hookup. Kayla posted about it once, calling it a season of rebuilding. The photo had fairy lights strung above a beige couch and a caption about gratitude. I recognized the lights. I bought them for Lily's birthday party 3 years ago. I didn't react. Not when Lily switched schools. Not when Max missed the fall soccer sign-up. Not when a mutual friend mentioned Brian had started doing rideshare work just to fill the gaps. I simply lived my life. I woke early, walked to the corner store, shared warm bread with the man who played violin on the corner of Maple and 8th. I began painting again, badly but freely. My apartment smelled like rosemary and old paperbacks. I kept the windows cracked just enough to hear the traffic. One night, I found a message in my inbox, not from Brian, from Kayla. The subject line was blank. The body, just 1 sentence. We didn't know it would go this far. I didn't answer. Because it hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply returned to where it always belonged, on their own shoulders. They called it collapse. I called it gravity. It arrived on a Thursday. The subject line was simple. Hi, Mom. I hadn't seen those words in over 9 months, not since the cabin, not since the porch light flicked on without ever showing my reflection in their front window again. I hovered over the message, not opening it right away, letting it sit in the inbox like a quiet knock on a door I had sealed from the inside. When I finally clicked, the page took a second longer than usual to load, almost like it too, hesitated. The message was long, polished but not rehearsed, full of phrases that tried too hard to sound casual. Just checking in. Hope you're doing okay. The kids miss you, especially Lily. Buried in the second paragraph, I saw it. The apology. Small, almost weightless. If we made you feel like you weren't welcome, I'm truly sorry. That wasn't our intention. But it was. It had always been. The next line asked if I might want to come over for dinner sometime. Kayla was making her famous roast. Max had drawn a picture of me in school, apparently, and they'd saved it. He wanted to give it to me. I read the email twice, then again, and then I closed the tab. I didn't delete it. I didn't reply. I didn't forward it to Mr. Landon for record keeping. I simply let it sit, read, time-stamped, and untouched. A living reminder that not every open hand needs to be met. Because I had seen their idea of welcome. It looked like a packed suitcase and a trail of silence. It tasted like lukewarm tea and dry cookies. and it felt like being erased while still breathing. That week, I spent most afternoons at the library downtown. I liked the way the windows caught the late sun, spilling it across the hardwood floors like melted gold. I read slowly, not because I needed to anymore, but because I wanted to stretch every word. There was a small cafe next door with a bench under a fig tree. I sat there on Thursdays drinking coffee that wasn't very good, watching people walk by and not knowing me. It was a new kind of invisibility, one I chose. And while they spun their new version of the story, she left too soon. She misread everything. She needs help, not distance. I built a life without explanations. The next email came 2 weeks later. Shorter, less composed. No apology this time, just confusion. "Can we at least talk?" it asked. "We're trying to move forward, but it's hard not knowing what you want." That was the last message I ever got, because silence, when protected long enough, becomes a language of its own, and I had spent too many years translating myself into someone they could tolerate. Now I had no more revisions left. I changed my email address the next morning. I brewed tea in a new mug, one with my name printed on it, in a font no one else had chosen. I sat by the window, light on my hands, and let the day come without interruption. It wasn't much, just a 10 by 10 patch behind a row of senior apartments on the east edge of town, off a bus line, beside a chain-link fence, next to an alley that smelled of honeysuckle in spring and motor oil in summer. But it was mine. The manager called it a community garden, but there weren't many of us who showed up. Just 3 other women, all older than me, all quieter than me. We didn't talk much, just nodded when we arrived, pointed toward the hose when someone needed water, occasionally left a sprig of rosemary or a small squash on the edge of someone else's plot. I planted lavender first, then basil. Then carrots I knew wouldn't grow well but tried anyway. I brought an old stool to sit on while I worked. I wore gloves on some days, bare hands on others. I liked the way the dirt stayed under my nails, like proof that something had passed through me and left a mark that wasn't sadness. There were no birthdays here, no Mother's Day brunches, no orchestrated attempts at reconciliation, no gifts with tags that said, "You're the glue of this family," taped over guilt and memory. There was just sun and dirt, and the quiet miracle of a green stem breaking through something that once held it down. Sometimes I brought a book and read aloud to no one. Sometimes I brought an apple and watched it turn brown in my palm. I wasn't trying to prove anything, not to them, not to myself. Just trying to see what grew when no one expected anything of me. My name was never mentioned in their updates anymore. I checked once, late at night, when sleep wouldn't come. Brian had a new job at a mid-tier insurance company. Kayla had started writing essays on parenting for a lifestyle blog. They were rebuilding, as people like to say, but there was no trace of me. No photos, no captions, no anniversary shout-outs. I was gone so completely, you would have thought I never tucked them in at night, never paid for piano lessons, never wrote their teachers when report cards went quiet. And yet, I wasn't erased, just rerouted. There's a difference. Erasure is when someone scrubs your name from a page. Rerouting is when you stop handing them the pen. I kept a small journal in my bag now. I wrote in it each day, not about them, not anymore, but about what bloomed, what didn't, how the sun shifted through the trees near the bench at 3:45 p.m., and how sometimes silence arrives, not as a punishment, but as a garden with no gate. No one asked where I lived. No one called Mr. Landon again. No one stood outside my apartment holding flowers. But last week, a small envelope arrived. No return address. Inside was a folded drawing. Crayon. Purple background. A woman with gray hair and a flower in her hand. On the bottom, In large, wobbly letters, it said, "Hi, Grandma." I didn't cry. I didn't frame it. I didn't rush to respond. I simply tucked it inside the back of my journal, behind the pages where I wrote about Rosemary and Son. Because even soft things can live in silence. And I was learning how to be both. It fell on a Tuesday that year. The sky was overcast, but soft, the kind of gray that makes everything feel wrapped in cotton. I woke at my usual time, brewed tea, and buttered a slice of toast that I never quite finished. There was no calendar alert, no text from a well-meaning friend, no card slipped under the door. Just the quiet realization as I opened my curtains and saw the rosemary bowing ever so slightly in the wind. Today was my birthday. There had been years when it was a full table, balloons taped to kitchen chairs, overcooked pasta, a song off key, a lopsided cake with too many candles. Photos taken that no one ever printed. Gifts that felt more like apologies. I used to remind them, days in advance, sometimes a week, just to make sure it didn't fall through the cracks. This year, I said nothing, and nothing arrived. No call, no email, no accidental voicemail, just silence. Familiar, steady, not cruel, just final. The kind of silence that settles into the corners of a room and learns how to stay. I took myself to the small cafe near the garden, wore a soft blue scarf and the cardigan with the mended sleeve. Sat in the corner booth no one ever chooses, where the sunlight hits just the edge of the table. I ordered a lemon tart and a second cup of tea. The server asked if I was celebrating something. I said, "No, just making space." Afterward, I walked to the bookstore, let my fingers brush against the spines of novels I wouldn't buy. Picked up a memoir by a woman who'd once lived in a lighthouse alone and underlined a single sentence in my head. There's peace in not being expected. I returned home before sunset, watered the garden, lit a small candle, not for ceremony, not for ritual, but for warmth. I placed it beside the drawing Max had sent, still folded behind the pages of my journal. I didn't open it again. I knew what it looked like. I didn't need to prove it had arrived. As evening pressed in, I turned off the lights, sat near the window, and watched the glow fade from one side of the city to the other. Somewhere across town, maybe Brian realized too late. Maybe Kayla remembered over dinner. Maybe not. But I didn't wait. I didn't check my phone. I didn't wonder if the mail had run late. Because the greatest gift I gave myself wasn't absence, it was release. And in that still room, surrounded by quiet, with no footsteps coming up the stairs, I felt something I hadn't known I needed. Not love, not forgiveness, freedom. The kind you don't earn, the kind you finally choose.